Pope Leo engages Islam, but is he going far enough? And a new Vatican document on the ordination of women emerges. We'll tell you about it on this edition of the Prayerful Posse. Welcome to the Prayerful Posse. Be sure to go subscribe to the show now. It's a wonderful way to support our work, totally free. Or you can visit RaymondArroyo.com if you'd like to contribute. Let's convene the Prayerful Posse. Canon, lawyer, and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray, and editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal. Gentlemen, thanks for being here. We need to talk about Pope Leo's recent trip to Turkey and Lebanon. It actually didn't get a lot of coverage here in the United States. I want to talk about the implications of his references to Islam, which were really only at arm's length. In Turkey, Leo said this about religion and violence: "We must strongly reject the use of religion for justifying war, violence, or any form of fundamentalism or fanaticism. Instead, the paths to follow are those of fraternal encounter, dialogue, and cooperation." Father, given the context, standing in a Muslim-dominated country with a history of Christian persecution, Turkey, given what's happening in Syria and even Lebanon, where the Pope visited, Christians are being targeted there by Islamists. What do you make of this statement?
Yeah, I think the Pope is addressing that precisely to those Islamists, those, radical jihadis who continue to, wreak havoc throughout the world, particularly in Africa, the Middle East. So I think it's a very good message, and it's one of the goals of the Holy See, and I think also of, Western countries in general, is to encourage moderate Islamic countries to reject and suppress the violence that's being carried on by the Islamic State and other groups. So I was encouraged by those words. I think it's good, and certainly that's the way peaceful coexistence can exist, where you do have Christians and Muslims living together, such as in Lebanon.
A while back, a man I didn't know showed up at my front door. He'd found my address online and he wanted me to deliver a letter to someone he'd seen on one of my shows. My family was inside. And that's when I started taking our digital safety seriously, because the threat doesn't end at the doorstep. For too many seniors and families, the bigger danger isn't someone finding you, it's someone becoming you. Rerouting a Social Security deposit, opening credit in your name, filing a fake tax return, even sticking you with medical bills using your Medicare details. Most people discover it when the bank or collectors call. How does it happen? Data brokers build and sell dossiers on you, your name, your address, phone, income, even your family ties to anyone willing to pay. They don't vet the buyer. Scammers, spammers, stalkers, they all get through. That's why today's sponsor is Aura. Aura finds where your personal information is being sold. It removes it and keeps it off automatically. More than removals, it's a one-stop shop for online protection. Dark web alerts, real-time fraud alerts for credit and banking, continuous monitoring, a secure VPN, antivirus, a password manager, and U.S.-based support around the clock. For parents and grandparents, Aura's parental controls connect your kids' devices to your app, so you can see exactly what your kids are seeing and block harmful content. Safety for every generation. For our Arroyo Grande audience, start your 14-day free trial at aura.com. That's AURA.com/Raymond Arroyo. Or scan the code. There's nothing more important than protecting your loved ones, and Aura does just that. Bob, speaking in terms of history, when we talk about religious violence, shouldn't a distinction be made here between the Crusades, which were a defensive war to protect Christian pilgrims, and jihad as articulated in certain interpretations of Islamic theology?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we can all hope that there'll be a reform within Islam and an encouragement, as Father says, of these more moderate elements. I mean, the best we can do when we disagree fundamentally, as we do with Muslims, is to seek a way to live peacefully alongside one another. But I'm a little bit skeptical that this is going to work out, because it's kind of built into the nature of Islam that it is militant. Muhammad himself was a leader, was a battle leader. There's something like 40 plus battles that he was involved in. And, he justified them, at least from what we can see in the Quran and the Hadith, which are the stories about him. So look, it's great to try to do this, but we have to recognize, and I think Leo kind of intuits this, we have to recognize that there is a fundamental difference in the way that we look at things. Catholics think of Jesus as the Prince of Peace. I think that the peace in the fundamental understanding in Islam is conquest. Conquest either by conversion or by military means. So look, we want to treat each other fairly, but I think fairly and truthfully in this instance means recognizing that there's a deep problem here that I don't believe the church has yet come to grips with.
Well, what do you make of, and there's a critique this week from the human and religious rights group in Nigeria that's blaming the Vatican for its confusing narrative on what's happening there to Christians in that country, Bob. I mean, dancing around the edges of this, this is something Pope Benedict did not do. He was very forthright. Do you worry that this is so nuanced that it has no teeth, and then the Vatican just backs off or falls into silence when they actually have to confront an ongoing Islamic persecution of Christians, as is the case in Nigeria?
Yeah, and not only in Nigeria, by the way.
Right.
The jihadis have moved, well, they're still in the Middle East too, but they've also moved to other countries in Africa and East Asia, etc. Yeah, it's very interesting that Inter-Society, that group in Nigeria, and also some of the bishops in Nigeria, have blamed Cardinal Parolin for what has become kind of a standard account in the Vatican, because Pope Leo has said this as well, that, well, there are these conflicts between Islamic cowherders and Christian farmers for land, and that climate change has put pressure on everybody, and that this is a social conflict and an economic conflict. There is an element of that in Nigeria. It's true. But it's not the main show. The main show is 10,000, probably at least 10,000 Christians will be killed in Nigeria in 2025. So, you can talk about these other things, but when you're especially when Parolin made that statement that everyone is kind of up in arms about, it was at the time when Aid to the Church in Need had its annual review of Christian persecution and martyrdom in the world. And it looked as if he was trying to not exactly make light of, but divert attention a little bit away from the fundamental problem, which is a certain type of Islam that thinks it, as it always has throughout history, thinks that it has a right to military action against Christians.
Yeah. Father, on December 1st, at an ecumenical and interreligious meeting in Beirut at Martyr Square, Pope Leo had this to say about the relationship between Islam and Christianity. Dear friends, your presence here today in this remarkable place where minarets and church bell towers stand side by side, yet both reach skyward, testifies to the enduring faith of this land and the steadfast devotion of its people to the one God. Here in this beloved land, may every bell toll, every adhan, every call to prayer blend into a single soaring hymn, not only to glorify the merciful Creator of heaven and earth, but also to lift the heartfelt prayer for the divine gift of peace. Now, Father, Pope Benedict, as I referenced a little while ago, he had a very different approach. He was quite clear about the theological distinctions. What do you read into this language, particularly this mention of one God? Is that just trying to blend things? I mean, Islam explicitly denies the divinity of Jesus Christ and the Trinity.
Right. No, we have to recognize that the Islamic teaching about the nature of God is at odds and contradicts the Catholic and Orthodox and Protestant teaching, which is there's one God in three persons. And, the minaret and the church bell have two different purposes. They don't blend a hymn together to God. The minaret is a call to faith in Islam, whereas the church bell rings precisely to summon people to Mass. In other words, the bell of a parish church is meant to awaken people in the morning or during the day to call them to mass. In fact, it's interesting because when the Islamic forces conquered Spain, they took all the church bells out.
Right.
Because they don't want that form of annunciation of that Mass will be celebrated to happen. So it's wishful thinking. It's poetic. It sounds good. You know, it's kind of like we are the world. Can't we all sing together? But you know, and I'm not going to criticize the idea that we want people who are Islamic and Christian to pray to God that there be peace.
Right.
But it's not going to be a peace based on the false notion, in my opinion, that the goal of an Islamic religious society is the same as the goal of a Christian religious society.
Yeah.
They're two different goals. And our goal is to preach the gospel and hopefully people freely accept it. The goal of Islam is to impose Sharia law on the world, willingly or unwillingly. It's just a different concept.
Well, I want to bring this in, Bob, and this is, again, I called this episode the Pope Leo two-step on Islam because on the one hand, you see him kind of smudging this idea that we all believe in the same God, which we clearly don't. And then on the other hand, on November 28th, earlier in his trip, he visited the Blue Mosque. And when he arrived, he removed his shoe as a sign of respect. But notably, he declined to offer prayer there. He said, that's okay. When they said, do you want to offer a prayer? Your thoughts on the significance of that moment, and how do you think the Muslim world interpreted that?
Yeah, I think that's a good sign, actually. You know, I have friends who are theologians who I respect, who think that we can say that we and the Muslims worship the same God. I don't believe that that's true, but there are people who think that, and I think probably Pope Leo is been influenced by them and by the fact that he is kind of a public political figure when he goes on a trip like this. For me, though, if it were me, and if he had asked me to write some of those texts that he read, I would have preferred, and maybe this is a way that the Vatican can approach these questions, that you say, look, and I especially encourage, he says as the Pope, I especially encourage we Christians who believe in Jesus as the Prince of Peace, that we bring that notion of Christian peace to bear in our own hearts and in our relations with our neighbors. If he were to do something like that, he would maintain the Christian distinction and then at the same time reach out to the other religions in the region. And the fact of the Blue Mosque, I thought this was very interesting. He also did not go to Hagia Sophia, which has now been turned back into a mosque. It was a museum under Atatürk, and for a long while, just a little while ago, it was turned back into a mosque. I think that just smidgen of separation says, yes, we can all try to live together, live alongside one another and respect one another. But one of the ways that we respect one another is respect that you are different than we are. That you don't think that we're the same as Islam, and we are going to just recognize that we are not the same as you either. I mean, it's a small gesture that he made, but it's big in another way.
Father, I can see you reacting. You wanted to add what?
No, I think that's precisely. Remember, Hagia Sophia was the great Christian church of Constantinople. So to go in there, and I think it was a good idea not to go in there since it's been reclaimed as a mosque. Atatürk, the great unifier of Turkey after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, he specifically wanted a secular society. Now, he did crimes against the Armenians. I'm not going to justify any of that. That's completely wrong. But in this regard, he didn't want to have that continue as a mosque. And what Christians would like it to be restored as a church, but that's not going to happen as far as we can tell right now. But no, at Bob's point, I would say I agree. Bob's analysis is on target.
Well, let's pick up on that Atatürk question, because Leo did go and pay respects to the tomb of Atatürk in Ankara, which frankly I had mixed emotions about. Atatürk, as you mentioned, he's a legendary figure in Turkish history. He's considered the father of the Turks, established the Republic of Turkey in 1923, but he also oversaw the suppression of religious freedom, persecuted and the death of Christians, and he oversaw the final dissolution of Christian communities in Asia Minor. Why would Pope Leo decide to honor Atatürk by going to his tomb, Father?
Well, I think one would be a protocol thing that he's honoring the Turkish government by honoring the founder of the modern Turkish state, and then you can secondly say, the cruelty and the murderous aspect of Atatürk's rule has to be seen also that he wanted to develop a secularized society where Christians and Muslims could live in a secular society. Now that's a big debate, and I'll leave that aside.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, it's debatable. If he hadn't gone, nobody would have been upset on our side. Maybe the Turks would have been upset. I don't know what Bob thinks of all that.
Yeah, Bob, your reaction, and as Father referenced, Turkey still denies the Armenian genocide, which, slaughtered untold numbers of Christians in the early 20th century, an event, by the way, that drove a wedge between the two nations ever since. Pope Francis called it a genocide in 2015. Should Pope Leo have taken the opportunity to do the same?
I think Pope Leo actually did mention, my memory is a little hazy about this, but I think he did mention the Armenians, and I think the Armenian Orthodox were together with him during one of the prayer services. Yeah, I mean, look, Turkey tried this experiment of secularism. They've become more explicitly Islamist in recent years under the current regime there. But the secularization is, it's imperfect. There are Christian churches and Christian activities around Turkey. I was in Turkey some years ago. In Ankara itself, though, I was in the nunciature in Ankara, and the only mass available in Ankara was in our actual Vatican embassy in Ankara, in the capital of Turkey. And, some of the people there said, well, we love to try to have a mass outside, but it was just impossible under the circumstances at the time. So Turkey is a very interesting country. I like the Turks. When I was there, I was very impressed with them. They tried to reach out to us as Christians. They were, they're very respectful and hospitable and whatnot. So look, there could be some progress made there. Turkey is a very important, powerful country in the Islamic world, and whatever advances we can make will really only help things. But there are limits to what you can do with any Islamic state, it seems to me.
Well, and what papal visit would be a papal visit without the plain press conference on the way home? Francis made these kind of, standing events that everyone anticipated. So Pope Leo has once again continued that tradition. He touched on the subject of migration, saying that oftentimes fears about the spread of Islam, here it comes again, outside the Middle East are generated, quote, by people who are against immigration and trying to keep people out who may be from another country, another religion, another race. Father, is it fair for Leo to dismiss legitimate concerns of citizens of countries who are experiencing problems like here in Washington, D.C., we just had this Afghan national cap two National Guardsmen, killing one and hospitalizing the other?
No, and you remember in France, we had the Bataclan massacre, we had the Charlie Hebdo attack, we had the guy who stole a big, 18-wheeler and ran down the road along the shore in Nice, running people over. No, there's a history here. Now, since it's religiously based violence, it's particularly heinous because what we're facing here is a challenge that we're not used to in the modern era, which is a group of people claiming to represent the faith of Islam by killing Christians, because that's the clear goal of what they're doing. They view France as a Christian country. They're not attacking because they're secularists. They're attacking because they're Christian, and they want to kill Christians as a way to force them into submission. And this is a big problem. So the idea, for instance, Hungary and other countries want to control access to immigration to non-Christians. This is a legitimate approach that a political entity, it's a government representing the people, they can adopt that because there's no right to mass immigration in Catholic teaching. And it's quite clear. If let's say Italy announced today, there'll be place for 40 million Muslims to come into Italy, and we're going to facilitate port and airport facilities. You can come on in. Now, Italians are never going to do that. So that's not, but if people coming in illegally and they stop them, well, that's just another way of them enforcing the will of the people. So there's no problem with that. In my opinion, I wish the Pope would make a few more distinctions, because when you say people are acting out of fear, what you merely mean is they're acting irrationally. And I would say, no, it's not irrational.
Yeah,
it's based on facts.
I mean, Bob, we're seeing this in all across Europe. In Brussels, at Christmas market, you saw those demonstrations over the weekend. These Muslim activists, shooting off fireworks and pushing people down. There were nativity scenes stolen from that marketplace. I mean, even the European bishops are experiencing churches being burned and Christians attacked. So why do you think the Pope is so reluctant to speak out clearly on who is perpetrating these attacks on his own flock?
Yeah, I think he has it exactly backward. I don't think that people are using Islam as a excuse to oppose immigration. I think that they're opposing immigration because of Islam.
Right.
And I have to say that I think in larger geopolitical terms, this is a loser for the church to continue this. I mean, certainly we want to be humane toward every person that we encounter. But as I keep saying, the fact that we want to respect human dignity is not a political policy. What it is an orientation toward persons. And all that other political stuff has to be taken into account. Look, in that example of Brussels that you just mentioned, Raymond, the Brussels City Council, as I understand it, had already, in the name of to be more inclusive, decided not to call it a Christmas market. They decided to call it Winter Wonderland, or it was Winter something or other.
Well, and they also created the new a new nativity scene with no faces to try to bring things down a notch, according to the mayor there.
But look, this massive immigration problem also there's a problem here. And the church is really trying to impose what is a populist uprising in many countries now. I mean, it's even the case in places in Africa where immigration becomes an internal problem. And it's only going to get worse because, especially in the case of Islam, fortunately in America, most of our immigrants are illegals, have been Christian, either Protestant, evangelical, or Catholic. But with this clash with Islam that we talked about earlier, this is really difficult. I mean, you can lambaste countries all you want for saying that they haven't integrated people, but a lot of times these people don't want to be integrated. They want to live under Sharia law in their own little enclaves, which they have a right to do in other places, but not where the rule of law, of Western law, is going to run. And by the way, just to as an aside, I also think the church is 20 years behind the curve on climate questions. I mean, the Pope and others have been talking about climate driving illegal immigration. I don't believe that that's the case.
No.
And even in terms of what climate people who are studying climate questions are now saying, I mean, there's just been a study that came out in Nature magazine, which has really turned to it's very authoritative, but it's a very left-wing magazine. They're saying that the economic disruption they had previously predicted owing to climate change is not going to happen. Bill Gates is saying, look, the human race is not going to disappear because of climate change. So the church, I think, has got to get with where the realities are at this moment on both immigration and on climate, and to keep repeating these things that were okay maybe 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. They're a non-starter, and they make the church look like it's not engaging in synodal conversations with people that they are allegedly supposed to be speaking.
Well, it also makes the church look foolish. I mean, Jesus Christ came out and he pointed the finger at Herod. He pointed the finger at the Sanhedrin because he saw what was happening clearly, and he articulated that for the flock. My concern is not even that they're not keeping up with science or politics. They're not protecting their own flock and willing to go out and stand in the breach and say, no more of this. You are the ones attacking our people, and the world is not going to put up with that, and we certainly aren't. But it's like there's a reticence, we're all going to get along in the minaret and the bells are going to ring. I don't think so. Anyway, moving on, some big news out of the Vatican today. Father, that study group initiated by Pope Francis back in 2021 to study a female diaconate, ordaining women to the diaconate, to be deacons, has released its report. It rejects the possibility. Here's what they determined. I'm going to read this quote. The commission writes, the status question is of historical research and theological investigation, as well as the mutual implications, excludes the possibility of proceeding in the direction of admitting women to the diaconate, understood as a degree of the sacrament of holy orders. In light of sacred scripture, tradition, and ecclesiastical magisterium, this assessment is strong, although it does not allow for a definitive judgment to be formulated at this time, as in the case of priestly ordination. Now, Father, does this decide the matter? Does this end it?
It should end it, because what they're saying is that there is no basis in history or theology for the assertion that the church has the ability to ordain a woman a deacon. And it's interesting because the paragraph you quote also has a footnote. And in the footnote, it says, we cannot see how, if you ordained a woman a deacon, you could then deny them to be ordained to the priesthood. And that is because there's only one sacrament of holy orders. There are not three. We have 7 sacraments, and holy orders is one of them. So if you ordain a woman to the diaconate, you're saying they are capable of receiving sacred ordination, and that the priesthood and the episcopate, which are second and third degrees of that, would then be open to them. But yeah, the reality is, and this is something I'm always insisting on, that what the church does is based on what the church believes it can do. And it's never ordained women deacons. The document also recognizes that there had been the phenomenon of deaconesses, which were minor orders, so to speak, and accommodation. Minor orders are not sacred orders in the sense of sacramental orders, but they were groups of women who helped in sacramental baptisms and the like for different reasons. So, but it recognized they existed, but it says they are not the same thing historically demonstrated to be what male deacons are, and the male deacons are the only deacons. So this, I think this document is a big success. On the other hand, I have to ask a question. Why are we getting this now? This document, there was a first female deacon commission, and they never reported on their activity. They submitted to Pope Francis. People complained about it. Pope said, I'll start a second commission. This is the work of the second commission. Now, we also know that the Synod on Synodality proposed the idea that we should look at women deacons, and that is one of the controversial questions given to the emerging questions group, now it's called. So, maybe Bob has some insight in this, but this, why are we getting this now? Yeah. What is this document telling us?
Well, Bob, in the report, the commission says they received, because of the synodal open door policy that suggested, hey, if you're concerned about female diaconate or you want it, write in, submit papers to us. 23 groups worldwide apparently submitted documents making the case for female ordination. Despite that, the commission says it needs more study, but they've kind of pronounced on this already. Does this issue really need more study?
Well, I say only semi-facetiously that we've had two millennia of non-deaconesses, and maybe by 3025 they'll definitively be able to pronounce on this. I mean, I don't know what else is going to change in the meantime that is supposedly going to move in a different direction. Look, the people who want deaconesses also want female priests.
Correct.
That's never going to happen. And so to keep holding out this possibility, further study, it just invites ongoing controversy that is never going to be resolved because they're not going to get what they want. And I think that the people who are doing this think that somehow that this is kind of a semi-political way to deal with it and say, we're still talking with people about this. But it only is going to continue to exacerbate the people who are out there and give them more trouble. It's not going to solve the problem that they're obviously trying to avoid in a certain way. My guess is at some point, some pope is going to decide that there's some deaconess, status that is not going to be ordained, but it's going to be a kind of a parallel to what we have now with permanent deacons. And that itself is not going to be satisfying because it's going to be your second rate. You're not actually ordained into the. So, look, they might as well just take the hit now and say, look, this has been decided. It's never going to change. Sorry, if this really is so bad that you can't remain a Catholic because of it, there's always the Anglicans.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, there's a reason Orthodoxy and Catholicism has never ordained a woman, because you can't do it. Historically, scripturally, and I love that the document does explain it that way. They also underscore, Father, the masculinity of Christ. And they say this is not arbitrary. This was intentional. And that there's something uniquely linked here between holy orders in the Catholic Church and the masculinity and sex of Jesus Christ.
No, there's no doubt. And that's actually reality contradicts ideologies that are based on fanciful recreation. I mean, people say, if only we could have been there at the creation, we would have told God, don't make two sexes, make one, then everybody's equal. God didn't do that. And we can say, well, when you're going to send your son into the world, maybe he could be a man for 15 years and then a female for another 15. These are crazy things. This is not what happened. This is not what God did. Yeah. This reminds me of that children's thing. This is the song that never ends. It just goes on and on, my friends. All we hear about is we got to do more study about female deacons. Yeah. The reality is this is all about female priests, but it's a wedge way to get into it. Mm-hmm. If the Pope said tomorrow, ordain a woman deacon, and some bishop did it, that woman would then stand up and say, I'm ready to be a priest. And no, you're not. Oh, yeah, well, wait a minute. Every other deacon become a priest. What's wrong with me? This is a non-starter. By the way, why are we arguing about this, really? It's about who gets to run things. It's about power.
Right.
Is the Catholic Church essentially an organization with power? No, it's an organization representing Jesus Christ and salvation. Now, that's the ultimate power, but it's not about who gets to tell people where they can act and what they can do. I'm tired of this politicization of religion as if Catholicism is deficient because not everybody's happy with the arrangements. Yeah. No, get with the program. Jesus is the one who set this up.
Yeah, take it up with God. The liturgy, meanwhile, this is what we need a study of. The liturgy wars continuing in parts of the United States, despite the passionate pleas of members of his flock. Bishop Mark Beckman of Knoxville, Tennessee, is doubling down on his decision to ban the TLM in all parishes of his diocese, once again relegating it to a single non-parish location, in the case of Knoxville, a retreat center. And it's only offered once a month. Bishop Beckman, Father, cites instructions from the Doctrine of Faith office in Rome, as well as recent discussions with the Apostolic Nuncio, Cardinal Christophe Pierre, as justification to halt the TLM. Your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, this is why we hope and pray that Pope Leo will deal with this. And, I'm not in favor of these interviews all the time at Castle Gandolfo, but it would be nice if someone came up and said, do the people in Tennessee who can't get the Latin Mass have less rights than the people in England who can get it? I mean, why is it that we're dealing with a situation which is the ultimate clericalist dream, which is the people come with supplications to their bishop, and the bishop says, you can't have this. And then they say, well, what the Pope allows, no, you can't have it. Now, wait a minute. What's going on here? The Pope said the people in England, they can have it. That's what the nuncio said. Mm-hmm. So this has to be dealt with. I mean, at root, this is, again, part of this rebellion against Catholic history, that somehow everything up to the new Mass is so bad that you can't allow it. That is a big error. That has to be done away with.
Yeah. Well, one hopes and prays that this extraordinary synod of cardinals that the Pope has called for at the top of the year, that this will no doubt be part of the discussion. I hope and pray it is anyway. I mean, it's a major issue in the church, as is the Christian persecution and the inability, I think, to voice clearly where it's coming from and what it is. In Charlotte, Bob, the ongoing assault on the Latin Mass continues. Bishop Martin there has asked parishes to voluntarily remove the kneelers and the option of kneeling for communion, but one parish is taking a stand.
After receiving multiple petitions from parishioners regarding the removal of the kneelers, we are suspending the removal until after a decision is made by a higher authority.
That's St. Mark's Catholic Church in Charlotte. Bob, your thoughts on this pastor's decision? He goes on to explain the norms for receiving communion and the option to kneel still being in effect all over the world.
Well, look, it just seems to me that Pope Leo is going to have to deal with this at some point, because that one particular parish, it's very interesting that the rule gets made that they're not going to kneel. And then obviously the pastor hears from people who say, wait a minute, I really feel I have to kneel to receive, the body and blood of our Lord. And rightly so, as a pastor, he says, well, okay, we'll bring these back. But we're going to have this constant, thresh and back and forth about this unless there is some decision made about these things. I don't know how you can have a bishop in North Carolina who disfavors a Latin Mass. And we know that the Pope just appointed a bishop down in Texas who favors the traditional Latin Mass. So are we going to have patchwork liturgies around places like the United States? And I think even, I know Father has said this in the past, that even allowing bishops to apply for permission, the Pope makes it clear that if you want to apply for permission, you can get it. That doesn't solve the problem. Because then again, we're a church that is strict about not having the Latin Mass in one place, and maybe is liberal about having the Latin Mass in another place. I mean, you can't have a better solution for this than the one that Pope Benedict gave us. Yep. That people can petition, they can do it, priests can do it, lay people can ask for it. No one is required to do it. It seems to me that this belongs to Christian liberty. And at a time when people are struggling to find a way into a deeper spirituality, why in the world prevent people from doing this who are not harming anyone else?
Well, Father, I harp on this almost every week. Practice is doctrine. And if you believe that this is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ, that's what the Eucharist is. I mean, we all kneel as a congregation during the consecration. You kneel at the Lamb of God. Why wouldn't you kneel to receive him? It's a rupture, in my mind, with the reverence that you present throughout the Mass, and that is not optional, but mandatory.
Well, when the surveys show that more than 50% of Catholics don't believe in transubstantiation, they don't believe that the body and blood of Christ is truly present, you have to say to yourself, well, how do we remedy that? Well, the traditional Latin Mass has a built-in remedy. Three things: communion on the tongue, communion kneeling, Mass facing east. Yeah. If you did all of those three things in the Novus Ordo, you would be teaching the people the same message that's taught in the Tridentine Mass, which is that God is the one who is the center of the liturgical action. That's why we're turned east, because Christ will come second comings from the east. We're looking forward to that. But in the meantime, we live on the bread of pilgrims, the manna, which is the body and blood of Christ. We receive it kneeling because that's the appropriate awe. When you're awed by God, you kneel. You don't want to stand there and say, I'm your equal. No, I'm not. And then on the tongue, because the body and blood of Christ is not ordinary food. Now, it's the church authorized communion in the hand. I'm not saying it's irreverent per se, but in my opinion, it's more reverent to receive on the tongue because it avoids accidents. I mean, we have people, this is really horrendous, and I hope the bishops in the U.S. will do something about this. We have ignorant people walking away with Holy Communion at Mass all the time. Yeah. And what does this lead to? Profanation by people who don't know what they're doing. Who knows what worse things are happening by others who have evil intent. We don't need this problem. If communion is on the tongue, we don't have people stealing the host. So, I mean, or walking away with unawares. The Eucharistic revival was a great idea, and I'm glad they did it. But now we have to go the next step. How does this become effective in our parishes? Yeah. And look, I agree with you. I think it's great getting people together, getting them focused in adoration and having, inspiring talks. But it's the lived experience every day that tells you what it is. If you walk in the door and your mother's in the house and you curse at her and you come in dressed like a slob, you're telling your mother what you think of her. I feel the same way about the Eucharist. You can't show up in your pajamas and you can't just grab it any way you want or approach the sacrament any way you want. It's silly. A recording of a Vatican official, Bob, discussing an FBI probe was leaked to the press recently. It involved Monsignor Jordi Bertomei, and he's a DDF official, a Doctrine of Faith official, and the Vatican's commissioner overseeing the suppression of a group. And it seems to show that the Vatican was aware of an ongoing FBI investigation into suspected money laundering by the group. Bob, what are we to make of this? Is this yet another financial scandal, another McCarrick-style situation where everyone knew but didn't act?
Well, look, this occurred in Latin America. We don't have a great deal of detail about what actually happened there, but what it looks like is that old protection of bishops and people in positions of power. The church is going to handle this quietly. There's no need for public scandal. They talk about making financial restitution to some of the people who were harmed by the if it was money laundering. It's just at this point in the history of the church, it's just not a good look at all, especially when we're talking about openness, transparency, accountability. It's everything that we, at least in the United States, we largely have moved past. And it looks like because of some of the things that are happening actually in Rome in terms of tracking financial activities,
Right.
It's just an anomaly. And, it's going to be the case that certain parts of the world are not going to be up to speed about this, but it's a very bad look.
Father, when the secular press has to break these stories, what does it say about the Vatican's ability to police itself and the promised transparency?
Well, I mean, this is a very important question. Transparency in the administration of justice. The reason that Monsignor was sent over to Peru was to investigate claims against the Sodalizio, which is a group that Pope Francis subsequently suppressed.
Right.
But part of the reason for the suppression was the accusation that ex-members were making that they were doing shady financial deals. And according to the story, and it's accurate as far as I know, and it hasn't been denied, the FBI came and interviewed somebody, I think this Monsignor Jordi, at the nunciature in Lima.
Yeah.
And then suddenly this thing gets leaked. Well, who leaked it? Why was it leaked? And then he's talking about telling the FBI that it's handled internally, and we're going to make some restitution. But he also said we have to protect bishops so no one gets harmed. It's all a cover-up. Now, what happens, and this Pope Francis administered justice in an unusual way. Rather than using regular channels, he appointed people he had confidence in, and they did these investigations, which weren't really according to canonical proper form. The right of defense was denied. Members of the Sodalizio, before it was suppressed, about 10 members were thrown out. They had no real chance to defend themselves in the canonical forum, and there was no appeal granted. If you give a penalty to someone, particularly in a religious matter, and you don't allow them a right to appeal based on maybe a faulty judgment or lack of evidence being heard, that's an injustice. So, and it's also troubling, I'll just conclude by saying, why is it that this story's broken and the Vatican has not commented on it? Because this is a serious matter. If they were trying to obstruct an FBI investigation in order to protect bishops in the country, why would those bishops need protection?
The Vatican just released new regulations regarding the administrative use of Latin. Now, I think this ties into the Latin Mass, but I know we have some disagreement on the panel about this, but Latin is now optional in drafting official Vatican documents. Father, what are the implications of making the use of Latin optional in official church communications, particularly given the assault we're seeing on the Latin Mass in parts of the church? They did bring back something called the Latin Language Office, but what does that mean?
Yeah, well, the reality is that most business done in the Vatican is done in Italian. It's not done in Latin. Now, official documents, the Code of Canon Law, for instance, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the official law is in Latin. The official version of the Catechism is in Latin. Similarly applies to other documents. But Pope Francis was in the habit of putting into the Acta, which is the register or bulletin of the Vatican, documents in modern languages. No Latin was produced. So the result is, I think, it's just confirming a reality that's historically inevitable, which is that as less and less people know Latin, it's not really useful for the Holy See to continue to use it on a regular basis. And therefore, we should get away from, I think, using simply Italian as the working language. English should be. This is an English-speaking Pope, more chance of that.
Bob, they're fine with Latin in administrative and official documents, but not the liturgy. And even then, it's now an option. Though Latin remains the Vatican's official language. Why is this not a good thing?
Well, look, I agree with Father to a certain extent. I mean, it is clear that the working language in the Vatican is Italian, basically. And I think there's going to be more and more English. When the Pope went to the Middle East, every presentation he made was in English because it's the lingua franca, ironically, which used to be French, right?
Yeah.
I believe that I don't know, it would be actually interesting if someone would take a deep dive into how documents are composed in the Vatican to begin with, because I know a guy who was involved in the one that was written about capital punishment, for example, and they had to look for language that would allow them to say that it was inadmissible without contradicting previous ways of formulating it in the catechism and whatnot. So, there are various questions about how Latin is used. I actually believe, however, that important documents like encyclicals, apostolic letters, etc., need to have an official version. Because we've noticed in the past that translations of the documents that came out of Vatican II or translations of encyclicals sometimes get very creative translations into modern languages. And so to have an official text, and I think it has to be in Latin, it's the only neutral corner, so to speak, to have an official text by which we can measure other versions, even if they're written initially in French or Italian or English or whatever is the case. I mean, I don't know that there are many texts that have come out in other languages without there being a Latin official text. One of the things that comes to mind is during World War II, Pius XI wrote Mit brennender Sorge, which was about the rise of Nazism in Germany, in German, and published it in German, and it had an enormous impact. It was good that he did that at the time. And we need to have the modern languages. But look, to know what we're doing, to be Catholics who understand some of the technicalities that are going to come out in official church documents, there has to be an official text. And I don't think that can be in English or in Italian. I think it has to be in the universal language of the church, which is Latin.
Yeah, I also think when you separate, Father, the administrative language from the liturgical language, to me, it's diminishing the liturgical Latin as a practice, because you've taken it out of practice in officialdom at the Vatican. And it's a dead language.
I'll just say in response to it, Latin was taken out with the Mass in English, or a Mass in the vernacular. I remember one priest once saying, the only reason you compel seminarians to learn Latin is they need to use it to celebrate the Mass. Most of them aren't going to read Thomas Aquinas in the original Latin or St. Augustine. So, and in the Holy See, it's a similar thing. I mean, you may remember, Bob, in the history and Raymond of the synods before, and Pope John Paul II and Benedict, they would have a Latin language circle. And there was primarily bishops from the Middle East and places like that, because they were all trained in Latin. Once they died, remember Cardinal Ratzinger's first homily when he was elected Pope to the bishops and cardinals was in Latin.
Yeah. As was his resignation, which most of them couldn't understand.
And they couldn't understand it. So for me, I agree. I'm a complete agreement. There has to be an official language, which is the reference point for all translations. But as a lawyer, I'm just going to say the ability for people to read that is so limited now in Latin that it'd be much better to be in English and establish style books starting now. What words are used to mean what based on the Latin heritage and et cetera. But right now it's a mishmash, and you can see it. I mean, we had these discussions with different documents that came out. The French and the Italian didn't match the English and the Latin. You just, no. Let's just, for me, I'm American, but I think English is the working. Every pilot who gets in a plane has to know English. And I think it's getting down to the point where everybody wants to participate in the ongoing world dialogue that's fostered on the internet. They have to know English.
Okay. Well, we have a disagreement still. I thought I could reconcile, bring healing on the way to Christmas. And speaking of Christmas, you see the buying orgy underway, the merchandising and all of the heavy sales going on. Father, tell us for a moment what Advent is. There's so many people that just rush into Christmas. What is Advent in the church? Why does the church observe the 4 weeks of Advent? What does it mean?
Yeah, no, Advent gets down to the reality that the church's calendar is organized around divine intervention in history. And divine intervention has occurred in the Old Testament, of course, with the people of Judea. But in the fullness of time, God sent his only son, we read in the scriptures. So that's Christmas. But the church said, we just can't start at Christmas. We have to prepare it. So 4 Sundays are set aside. And there's a double theme to Advent. The first theme is the second coming. Ironically, it's the same theme at the end of the year. We think about the second coming. But because the church is always looking east, so to speak. We're always looking for when Christ returns. So we think about that. And then the second half, much closer, is to celebrate the birth of Christ in Bethlehem. But again, for us, that's the beginning, really, of the salvation and the dispensation of the New Testament. So we prepare for it. It should be a time of penance. I love Santa Claus, the elves, Rudolph. I love the, candy canes. I was a kid. I'm still a kid at heart. Yeah. But now as a priest, I realized, no, we got to tell people, look east, look to the Savior. And when you do that, you say, Lord, I want to be ready for you spiritually.
Bob, you've written extensively about Catholic tradition and culture. What does Advent teach us that we desperately need now? Not only as Catholics, but really as a nation.
Yeah, I mean, look, what it teaches us is that there is a preparation. I mean, an awful lot of people think you just jump into God's arms and that's that. I mean, some of my children grew up with people who were evangelicals who would tell them that, once you accept Jesus as your Savior, that's it. You can't go to hell. You go to heaven, and presumably everything you do is saintly after that. I actually have a discipline in my house that I struggle with. I don't allow the tree to be put up and ornaments to be put up in the house until Christmas Eve, which drives my wife crazy. My children cannot enforce this with my grandchildren because
I'll bet
they're part of the culture that we're in. But I like to think of us as we know that a celebration is coming. But in that in between time, we're reflecting on what is, this great thing that is going to happen. The greatest thing that's happened in the history of the world is about to take place when God comes into our world, tells us about himself, and redeems us from the sin and error that we've been in since the beginning of the human race. So, if you approach Advent in the right way, it's not just like a little Lent. It actually is. I find it illuminating every year.
Bob, I was going to ask everybody what practically they could do, what you would suggest. But we have your suggestion: keep the tree in storage until Christmas Eve. We get it. Now, we had a tradition with our family on the Feast of St. Nicholas, which is at the top of December. The children would put their shoes out and there'd be a little treat there, which was kind of a promise of what was coming. But it was a way of weaving St. Nicholas, the real St. Nicholas, into the secular celebrations with Santa Claus and everything else. And then, of course, after Christmas, we celebrated all the way to Candlemas and into the, we're lucky because in New Orleans, we have the carnival season, which is on the 12th night of Christmas. So, 12th night after Christmas. So it's a big, it's another celebration. The celebrations just keep rolling. Father, what should people do practically? I'll give you the last word. Word.
Aside from moving to New Orleans, which is a good idea.
Sometimes. Now that the National Guard is coming, yes.
Yeah, well, people, legal residents. But no, I would say Advent is a great time to make a good confession. I mean, there are a lot of people out there who love Jesus, they love Catholicism, but they feel that ill at ease in going to confession. They don't do it that often. So I would say, dust off your shoulders and say, okay, here we go. I'm going to do something I haven't done in a long time. Go down there, and believe me, if there's one thing priests like to do, is to help people come closer to God through hearing their confession. So don't seek. Some people say, "Oh, Father, I don't want to impose on you." Forget that.
Exactly.
If you need to go to confession, that's not an imposition. That's a liberation. We're happy to do it.
Mother Angelica used to say, you have to think early. What are you going to give the Christ child this year? Yeah. And her first answer was always, maybe you should give him your sins this Christmas time. So she was right in line with you. Go to confession. We will leave it there, Posse. Grateful to you all as always. We'll check in with you again next week. If you want more of the Arroyo Grande Prayerful Posse, subscribe to the Arroyo Grande Show on YouTube or the podcast, wherever you get yours. On behalf of Father Gerald Murray, Robert Royal, until the Posse rides again, stay the course, follow the light. It's Christmas light. I'm Raymond Arroyo. We'll see you next time. Bye now. Arroyo Grande is produced in partnership with iHeart Podcasts and DP Studios and is available on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you get your podcasts.